You don't need no reason to travel. Unknown horrors leaving in plain sight. Oh, God, stealing bread drives the world insane. Turn that evil darkness to healing light.
Welcome to Dark Loops, the Seers of Ardham, a podcast in which we, the Seers of Ardham, discuss HBO's fantastic new series, Lovecraft Country. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist, philosopher from Illinois State University. And tonight we're discussing episode 5, Strange Case. Joining me in tonight's discussion are the members of the Order. Brothers and sisters, please introduce yourselves and tell the audience a little something about who you are, and we'll start with Vanessa.
Yes, I brought my popcorn this evening because that was a movie, okay? So I have to have the popcorn with me right now. But I am Dr. Vanessa Hintz, licensed clinical psychologist here in the Milwaukee area, also a professor of psychology and equity and inclusion consultant.
Fantastic. Leandra.
I'm Dr. Leandra Parris. I'm a professor of school psychology at William and Mary, and my area is mostly around trauma-informed care and social justice and social media and bullying. I don't know. I'm in like a professional identity crisis right now. I know social justice and trauma-informed care is there. And some other stuff.
We're going to have to talk about that identity crisis. Help you out, right? We got the right people. Byron.
Hi, I'm Dr. Byron Craig. I'm at the Illinois State University in the School of Communication, and I'm a professor of communication studies.
Fantastic. And by the way, he has his own recording studio, as you can obviously tell.
That light is nice.
It looks great, man. Cianna.
Hi, my name is Cianna Greaves. I am a broadcast radio and podcast producer based out of Baltimore, Maryland.
He's also a diehard Liverpool fan, so
that is true.
Completely, absolutely. And Stanford, happy birthday!
Woo!
Thank you.
Went on that 23 thing, huh?
Well, you know, I'm 23 plus, just old enough to drink and not be an amateur.
There you go. So who
That's
wants
my
to
story.
start? There you go, man.
That's
what?
my story. I'm sticking to it.
There you go.
I'm Dr. Stanford Carpenter, a cultural anthropologist out of Chicago. But before I was about anthropology, I was actually an archaeologist. So I come to this as a person of multiple hats, and I'm looking forward to it.
No, it's fantastic. So who wants to start talking about this amazing episode? And I'm just going to say straight out, it was an amazing episode. Anybody who wants to disagree, that can be where we start. Favorite character, favorite line, favorite scene. Nobody?
Well, it was nice. It was nice to see my favorite character finally get her space, and that's Ruby.
Absolutely, hands down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
oh, your favorite character is Ruby. It's not George anymore.
George.
Just forgotten.
Left them.
Calling you out, man.
That was cold.
He only been gone like 3 episodes already. He in the back of your mind.
Exactly.
No. He's always up front. But seriously, you know, if we can't have George in the episode, Ruby. I thought this was a great episode. I love the way I loved what it centered. I love how it centered issues of, I mean, it was really about, I mean, there's so many metaphors for identity, passing, metamorphosis, yes. All of that, right? I think that the one downside of the show was I felt like, again, like this should have been more than one episode. I could feel like there's some stuff on the editing room floor that I would have liked to have seen. And, you know, while I want to talk about Ruby, I'll be honest, I really want to talk about what they did with Montrose's character. You know, and so I'm not sure which place to start. I got some really humdingers of some some favorite lines. But we're focusing on favorite character right now, huh?
No. Take this where it goes, because I guarantee you we're going to hear plenty of quotes. I guarantee you we're going to talk about Montrose, right? I guarantee you we're going to talk about every character at some point. So please just go continue.
Well, you know what? I'm gonna focus on Ruby. My favorite line of the whole thing is a Montrose line. So I'll wait for that.
Okay.
But it's when we have the reveal at the end, and Christina starts to pontificate, and Ruby just turns up to her and says, "Please shut the fuck up. You can't relate to who I am. The only thing you white women are disillusioned with are yourselves."
You know, that scene was so on point. And there's a thing in that scene where we've been watching Christine try to manipulate people the whole show. And to be honest, that was the one moment where I felt like she was almost being honest. Christine, right? That was the one moment where she was suddenly just putting her cards on the table. So I'm not trying to say there's a lot of empathy there on my part or anything, but it was interesting. And I'm just saying it was interesting that she came to that point, and her character and her relationship with Ruby. And it's like, no, please, no matter what you've done, this is not your space. And I just thought that was, to bring those tensions to that point, I guess is what I was saying. I thought was very well done.
I mean, it was a great moment, and that's one of the moments where I wish I would have seen, wish we had more time, and we could have seen what happened next.
And by the way, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Because the whole reveal around Christina, actually, metamorphosizing back to being William. Although I'm gonna add this in here as one of my predictions is, just because Christine is transforming into William does not mean William does not exist. Is that there is a tremendous amount of complexity there, given that William's function in the last 2 episodes has been to seduce Ruby, right? And I really wish that I wish we had more time so that you could really play that out. Like let us understand, because it's really cool when you have characters that can shapeshift, and that means that they can pretty much be with anyone or anything. But we rarely get into talking about what that means for conceptions of the self and what that means for conceptions of sexuality. I mean, it's just, if you think about it, that kind of like blows everything up, right? There's not, being a changeling is interesting in that it lays the groundwork for there being metaphors for, for being in the closet, for hiding, for passing, all of this stuff, right? But we don't have a metaphor for really what it means to be a changeling. To have that level of choice around identity, right? So if you have that level of choice around your identity, like all of a sudden when you start to really think it out, things like seduction just become much more fertile ground and much more complicated.
Drop the mic, Stanford, 3 weeks in a row.
No. So Stanford. So I have a question. I always had to have a question for you. So could that be where we go with? So remember, so Christina says this notion talks about this. The currency of magic is this unmitigated freedom. And so is that kind of like getting toward that whole kind of conceptualization of that self, right? Of the changeling possibly being this notion of, this kind of this unmitigated freedom that perhaps none of us really have, but maybe the changeling has that.
Well, and that's what I think is interesting about the changeling, right? On one hand, the changeling has this freedom to become, but in the process of becoming submits itself to a new set of rules. Right?
And it also interesting. I never thought the conversation would go this way, but what's also interesting is if you truly are a changeling, then you don't have a base. right? You don't, I mean, those who have the opportunity of, like we've talked about superheroes before, right? There's an individual that you would call yourself, and then there's an alternative self. If you're a changeling, there's no alternative self, right? And then so it'd be interesting to examine what that means.
Right.
And I think you could then examine stories of belonging, right? Stories of
Yeah, I mean, okay. I think even though, we talk, I think we're all changelings, right? At some point or another, we do wear a mask, we do put on a costume, we talk about code switching a lot, this whole notion of passing. I don't think you have to shed your individuality. Sometimes you're a changeling out of necessity.
Yes, no, this is, again, this is fantastic. Because I think most of us actually have multiple identities. And
Right.
one of the curses of contemporary culture is that we're supposed to know who we are.
Right.
It's like, why the hell do I need to know who I am in terms of some Scott is, put it on a paper, and then you all know me. There's a whole big world out there for me to be part of, right?
Mm-hmm.
And why should we have to constrain ourselves to just being one thing? And so I actually love the celebration of diversity within individuals, because then I think that preps them for being a little more open to the idea of diversity outside of their own identity. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm in.
And it seems like Ruby is starting to challenge that notion, right? When she changes back to herself after the stiletto scene with her boss, right? She's kind of, isn't she? She's kind of beginning to challenge that, right? She's challenging that notion of maybe having that foundation, or being able to say, I'm going to use this to kind of conquer this world of whiteness in some way, right? Where I'm going to change. I'm going to go back and forth with this changeling, and I'm going to use these identities, right, in a way that benefits me, in a way, right? And I think that whole episode is about this whole notion of, I actually have watched this episode like 7 times, just because I'm so taken with it. And I'll tell you that the line for me was this notion of unmitigated freedom, right? And I see that going on with Montrose. I see that going on with the drag ball scene. And I think the reason I'm so caught up on it, because I went back and I read some comments that people had written on some sites about Lovecraft Country. And just the way the demoralizing language they used about those scenes and about Montrose, I had to keep watching it to get past the negative comments that I was reading from folks. And I won't go further into that, because there's a lot I could say about that with race and sexuality. I just saw that whole.
We're more than willing to talk about it, man.
Yeah, let's talk about it. I have some thoughts on that.
I just saw some really ugly comments about it, right? When people were so, the whole notion of the sex scene with Montrose, and then the ball scene. It was just, I could not believe the negative comments I was reading about that, right? And, so I had to keep watching the show to get past the negativity of these comments, because they were just really bothering me a lot. But, I just saw that whole episode as this notion of trying to get to this freedom of the self, right? To a point where, I kept thinking, of course, about Nella Larsen's passing the whole time I was watching it, but just thinking about trying to get past those feelings of, I can't come up with the words right now, but those feelings of not being able to be yourself, right? And the way that would disempower someone, and and you see, that freedom, I think, in all these characters, once they start, understanding the power that maybe they have, when they get that moment of freedom, or they feel that freedom, right? And I think Ruby got that feeling of power, at the end when she sheds that skin of um, of uh, of
Hillary.
of Hillary Davenport, right?
Mm.
So, and the same thing for Montrose, and I think really the same thing for the same thing with Atticus to an extent, in the scenes that he was in this week, right? So,
And Byron, I really appreciate the language you're using, like freedom, because I think as an existential therapist, that's my only goal in therapy, is to empower people to understand that you have the freedom to do and be whatever you choose. And so, like, even to Cianna's point, like, who you are is absolutely dependent on the situation. So even answering that question, who are you? My retort is always like, in what situation? Because I think that, again, for people of color, that's a matter of necessity. And I think for everybody, it's a matter of really owning your freedom, because you are the author of you. And obviously that has implications societally. And I'm not saying that it's easy. I do, like, again, in therapy, that is exactly what I want to get people to see. And that's why the ballroom scene for me was also, when he was lifted up, like, I was like crying, because it was so beautifully done. And you could almost see him like regaining, or even gaining for the first time, sort of that freedom. And he was just so light and airy. And I feel like it was such a good representation of what I feel like clients experience in therapy, when they sort of shed all of those shoulds and expectations and really just live authentically and choose to live authentically how they want. So I really appreciate that language.
and you're right, because as a former performer, drag performer, that moment when you dress and you get into that character, and it's just like with acting, I think, right? There's a fear, but there's a freedom that comes with it as well, right? So especially if you're performing in drag, right? And that's why I appreciate that scene so much. And I'm so glad that Danye was the director for this episode, because I think she did it absolutely beautifully, right? And when you see this, when you're in that setting, when you're in that new skin, right? That's what it is. You're in a new skin. You transform into something completely different. And you're right. It's that moment that you're in, and that defines who you are in that moment, right? And I think that's what we saw with Montrose, and I think that's what we saw with a lot of the characters this week. It was all about that moment. Even when we see Hillary Davenport walking down the street, that first time, and she, Ruby Hillary has that, for that first time. As you notice in one of those scenes, when you first start that scene, she kind of walks off to the side on the sidewalk to let white people pass. And then she realizes, well, I don't have to do that now, right? Yep. So it is those moment-to-moment things, right?
And I think, to Scott's point, that's one of many problematic notions in contemporary psychology, is that to code switch in situations like that is not as privileged as having this, firm sense of self, who you are at your core, which is just dumb and something a white person made up. But I think that it's definitely like, it is definitely perpetuated. Like, I'm sorry.
No, we're agreeing.
You're agreeing.
It's amazing how many people are so uptight about being one person. They're so uptight about knowing exactly who they are. And it's this idea that I've got to be consistent across context. That's what gives me authenticity. And it's like, the problem is, every context doesn't need what you are right now. There are other contexts that need different things. There are contexts where Scott needs to make a decision now. There are contexts where Scott needs to shut up and listen, right? And if I try to spend all my time being one dude, I'm useless in most contexts.
Right. Well, but I think that what's interesting, and this is what people are caught sort of at the intersection of, is, you're right, we have to be different people for different contexts, right? But context by its existence demands a level of consistency that we're not capable of.
You have to suss that out for me, man.
So
let's pull that out.
What context does is it's describing certain types of roles, right? It's almost like, think of it as the flow of the river, right? And so context actually demands consistency of the actors within, right?
Yeah.
But the irony is that context also changes.
Yes.
So it's not just a matter of us walking into the context. It's like it's us going into a context that's a flowing river that's pushing us in a direction that is actually inherently demanding that we act in a certain way. I mean, we're seeing this. I mean, we see this in almost any profession. We see it in politics as well, right? Like there are certain political positions that have specific demands, right? It doesn't matter who you are or what your politics are, right? At a certain point, if you're a prosecutor, your job is to put people in jail. That's a huge part of your job, right? And it centers around those types of decisions, whereas if you are a legislator, your job is more around building and arguing for rules, right? And so each of those contexts, there's a demand in there, right? It's not that you just walk in and get to, and get to do what you want.
No,
you get to decide what type of prosecutor, what type of legislator you want to be. But still, you're going with that flow, and that context is demanding consistency within that space.
I don't disagree that there's a role we play in a context. And I would also say that some of the choices we've all made in life is whether or not we want to remain in that context and play that role anymore.
Right.
So we step out of that context. So all I'm saying is what I enjoyed about the episode was the focus on agency, right? And the focus on people putting themselves in context or not. One of the things Ruby, by the way, is my favorite character. And Ruby went through this incredibly intense experience, and it was a metamorphosis for her, and she was basically alone.
Yeah.
Right? Montrose got to go through a massive metamorphosis with a whole group, supplying him energy and providing affirmation. And so personally, what I hope is that there's a moment where Ruby gets to be in a space of a bunch of people telling her that she's fantastic, right? Because she went through this change, and the courage it took to move through those spaces alone really amplifies her agency for me. And I think I was mainly reflecting on having the agency to be able to navigate different spaces and say, no, not in this context, I'm out. I'm going to this one. And
Yeah, and that's definitely something that I noticed during this episode, this emphasis of what it means and the power of having a safe space and having a community around you. Going back to what Byron said earlier, I did have a problem with the sex scene between Montrose and Sammy when I saw it. Michael K. Williams does anger very well. The way they write Montrose, he does that well. I guess I was just more disappointed that there was sort of this layer of desperation and violence to that scene, which I think is a little bit cliched when we see gay love on screen. I wanted the end to that end scene where he's at the ball and he collapses in his lover's arms and they're kissing. I mean, that's what I wanted. I didn't want to have to go through all that other stuff to get there. Watching it a second time and thinking about what you were saying, I think I'm just, first of all, having that scene play out with Frank Ocean's Bad Religion in the back was incredibly powerful, especially considering everything that Frank Ocean had to deal with when he published his coming out letter and just the scrutiny that he was under. It was incredibly powerful because it's actually also one of my favorite songs. But I guess listening to what you were saying earlier, maybe I'm more angry with the fact that agency and identity is harder to own when you're another. And sometimes expressions of tenderness and vulnerability, when you're a changeling, you have to suppress. When you're a changeling out of necessity and when you're a changeling for your own survival, those are things that you actually have to suppress. And I guess that makes that end scene where Montrose is at the ball with Sammy, I guess, a little bit more sweet. Mm-hmm.
That was one of the best love scenes I've ever seen. I thought it was that the ballroom scene was just so well shot.
Oh
so
yeah,
well acted. I cried both times I watched it. It was just so authentic. Yeah, Leandra, favorite character, favorite scene, favorite line.
Man, I just love listening to y'all. Can I say that? I missed you last week, and I'm like processing, and I sometimes forget that like I should talk. So I think I want to go back to what Stanford said about Ruby calling out Christina and the fact that she was like, you know, stop, like you can't understand where I'm coming from. And I think that, you know, I love that exchange because I've been the white woman on the couch trying to be like, well, like as a woman, you know, and then like having someone actually say like, no. And I think that watching that happen, I was kind of disappointed that Christina didn't have more of a reaction, but I get that that's not her character. But just the whole idea of she's trying to play everyone and she's trying to be everyone's friend at the same time, which is a very white woman thing to do. And she's trying to succeed in a world ruled by white men. So she's playing a game built for white men, trying to play by their rules. And she doesn't even understand that it's not built for her. And I don't understand why she's going about it the way that she is. I'm hoping we'll figure it out later. But I just felt like that whole thing kind of highlighted just the issue, just of the whole, like what Stanford was saying about like white women kind of coming in and trying to be like, oh, like I'm your friend. And it's the difference between like an ally and an accomplice, right? Like the ally is going to sit on the couch and look at you and be like, oh yeah, you know, and sympathize. But the accomplice is going to say like, no. And I thought that William was going to be more of an accomplice. Like he was my favorite character for a while because I thought like, oh, he actually does care about her, like he's gonna try to like open her eyes or give her some power, like give her this experience, and then you find out it's just Christina. And anyway, it ruined it for me a little bit.
Ruins everything.
Yeah.
Well, if we follow Stanford's thread, and they mean we don't know who this is,
right? Because
right.
Because the thing that's interesting is that when Ruby becomes Hilary Davenport, right? The actor that they're using for Ruby as Hilary Davenport is the same actor who played the woman in the second episode with the dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like when just because you metamorphose into somebody, it doesn't necessarily mean it's somebody who doesn't exist. It's somebody who could already exist. And then my other question is, okay, so what relationship does that person have? Are they just walking around going about their lives somewhere else? Or are they in some sort of pod somewhere? I don't know, you know, because they haven't given us any rules for the magic in this entire series, which is a little bit frustrating for me.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, I mean, I at the same time, I have to admit, they've got my attention. Let's put it that way. And I think that I think Christina's character is one of the more difficult characters because they're also having her serve different roles in each episode, and this is playing out more like an anthology, right? Than something with a continuous arc, and so it's hard. It is somewhat hard to reconcile that.
So,
and I was caught off guard. Like I don't know if anyone else, and I'm just gonna admit it. Maybe I wasn't paying enough attention the first time I watched it, but like. I honestly thought William was going to change into another person of color or something, you know, like I did not expect it to be Christina. So when it was Christina, like there was a moment of like, huh, and like going back and being like, that's why they both seem so familiar. Like I thought they were twins and like literally maybe they are. So I also really like that scene. I don't like the implication of it, but I do like the fact that it caught me off guard, which is actually pretty rare for me, that I totally was not expecting that to be Christina. And I just remember like sitting at it and like I think I had the same look on my face as Ruby of like, what the is happening, you know, like.
Yeah. Well, I think we still have to give Vanessa her props for calling this a few episodes ago.
Yes, that's true. I know. And like I even thought about that later. I was like, you know, Leandra, if you were but like
Yeah.
She's just looking at all the wrong things.
No. So look, Game of Thrones had its red wedding, right? I think this episode was the red stiletto episode.
Oh,
Oh,
I wanted this to be my favorite scene. I'll be honest. I wanted it to be, but like I couldn't.
What I loved about it, when I watched it the second time, it's like, wait a minute, this is a horror movie, right? I mean, we've been looking at the twist on what horror is, and it's like, but wait a minute, people watch movies with guys stabbing people all the time, right? That's a horror movie. And so
It's
I
interesting.
mean, the racism literally came to bite him in the ass. Sorry.
So, like, horror is my thing, and one of the horror movie tropes of like the early 2000s, and I would argue we're kind of still in it, is like torture porn, and it was never something that I liked. And I found myself like I looked away in that scene because I was like, okay, like it was a lot. But that was my opinion because that's not the type of horror that I like. A slasher movie to me is not that gore is different than what that was. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
I would watch somebody get cut in half like by a chainsaw. That was different to me.
right.
And so it was a lot. I'm not saying it's bad. It was just a lot for me. I was like, okay. And then that's why I couldn't watch the episode again. I was like, once was enough. Thank you.
No, that's very nuanced in the horror genre, right? Because when Eli Roth came on the scene in the horror world and started doing all of this, as you said, torture porn, these are things that didn't have a plot. It was, let's just find a way to dismember people and torture them. And there may have been a chase. I don't know. This may be going left, but I appreciate what you said there because I did watch the scene twice. So maybe I do watch it.
Want to talk about it?
Well, go ahead, Sam.
one of the things that was hard about it for me to watch, it wasn't the violence, it was the type of violence, right? I mean, here we are moving between Ruby and Montrose, and Montrose's scene, opens with sex, right? And then the movie kind of closes on that as an assault. And it's like, and I think all of that and some of that coding was one of the things that was shall I say uncanny for me. It was a little difficult for me to swallow. I didn't know how to process it. Is that, here we are finally dealing with Montrose, and we're finally starting to explore sexuality. We're finally figuring out and learning something about Sammy, because Sammy has been kind of this guy at the side of the scene for so many episodes. I mean, we first see him, he's getting a blowjob in an alley, right? And then he just is kind of popping up, right? And now all of a sudden it's like Montrose comes in, and I'll be honest, I'll tell you guys right now, if you don't mind, my favorite quote. My total favorite quote was when he walks in and Sammy just says, he says, oh, where is it? How do you say it? He said, he just looks at me and he says, was it the O-phase or the niggers this time? Right? I mean, that opening up, and I was expecting, actually when he said that, I was expecting almost a relaxation, because once you're in a familiar setting where someone has articulated and managed to use racial slurs for everybody, right? You would think it'd be a moment of relax and not a moment where we're conflating sex with assault. And so that type of coding really bothered me, because what it did is it created this shadow over Montrose's sexuality. I mean, we've already established that he's traumatized. We've already established that he's dealing with violence, and he's using violence, right? And I didn't think we didn't need any more of it. And I almost wish that had been the scene where, like, he just said yes, or maybe he was distant, but I don't think that we needed that explosion of violence. But then to come to the end of everything and have the ultimate revenge against this white guy, be having him literally be sodomized with a stiletto, given the other stuff that was happening, it was too many. Those are some uncomfortable parallels for me.
Yeah, it caught me off guard because she's been very, I think, controlled. Like, she's very goal oriented. She has a goal. She's going to work at this store. She's done, she's listing off these classes that she's done. It's just, she's always been, I felt like, very put together. And then to see her completely, like, the look on her face, like, she just completely unleashes. And so part of you is like, yes, you deserve this moment. And the other part of you is like, what has this done to you now that you've done this? And so I felt like that was, I wanted to cheer her on, which is why I wanted it to be my favorite scene, but like I couldn't do that. And I think, Stanford, when you were talking about Montrose, like, I felt like there was that moment where he was sitting in the room with all the other drag queens and he's so uncomfortable looking. He's so rigid and he's just like very, like, he hasn't accepted himself. And then in the ballroom, it's so beautiful because he slowly like relaxes, right? And he just kind of starts dancing. And so I think you're right that we could have had that moment just based on his body language. Then we didn't need to see the violence in that sex scene to pick up on this idea that he's not comfortable with himself.
Because this, and let me be clear, the sex scene didn't bother me. It's that it had to be violent, right?
Yeah.
I actually would have liked to have seen a scene that was a sex scene that was really more based on pleasure and because I just feel like I actually feel like I think that was a point where they kind of played to a lot of the most base and basic audience assumptions about life and misassumptions about life, right? And so yeah.
Well, I'm gonna go to the issue of that sex scene because on the one hand, the word violence might apply. On the other hand, Sammy understood who Montrose was. And Sammy, at least from the way I saw them depicting it, was enjoying it. So what I saw the writers trying to do between that scene and the final scene, right, was almost more about Sammy than Montrose, right? In other words, in the ballroom, Montrose walks, I believe Sammy takes his hand kind of stutters a little bit, then they take hands and they start dancing, and then he's on Sammy's shoulder, like Sammy's being his parent, right? So there's this incredible depth to how Sammy feels about Montrose, and I took it as, we can call Montrose's behavior violent. There's got to be some way we talk about Sammy's behavior as well. And because the gestalt there is one of compassion, intensity, suffering, acceptance. And I'm not going to say it was, all I'm going to say is I felt like I understood what the writers were after. There were things I didn't like about, what we would call the violent part. At the same time, I thought there was something the writers were starting to say about the dyad of the two of them. And man, the way it resolved in that second scene was just fantastic. I will watch that many times.
There was a hint of desperation too in that scene that I remember walking away and being like that. He seemed, Williams is really good at doing that, mixing in the anger with the desperation. So I do remember like feeling like there's a little bit of sadness along with that.
I'm happy you said that too, because that's exactly what I was gonna say in terms of like, I know we praise him all the time, but I'm just gonna say it again. Like Michael K. Williams, he does so much without saying a word. And in that scene, like that's what I saw. And I think I wouldn't use the word violence. I would almost like say dominance in a way, but it's kind of like, this is something I can't control in this moment. And again, not in a predatory way, but it's just like, I'm controlling this in this moment. And then you see like that he looked so, like you saw his face and he was kind of like grabbing onto his chest and I thought he was going to cry. I don't know if he did cry, but I was just in that moment, I literally was like, damn, like I feel that he just seemed, and I think I used the word last week, like he seems so, I don't want to say tortured because I don't think that's the right word, but just he had got a lot going on inside. And I mean, I feel like it all played out in that scene, just on his face, like in his actions too, but the way his face was, it was just so beautifully done. He's amazing.
Yeah, and then in last week's episode, it opened with
Mhm.
just a list of the things that he's got in his memory of his lived life, that
Mhm.
every once in a while in his life, he needs to be able to just let that go, right? I quickly wanted to go back. Go, please, go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, you know, Montrose, I'm gonna use another word other than violence. I'm gonna use the word rough, right? Because that exists within, you know, within gay culture, right? That sometimes there's rough sex. And I have to wonder, is this something that Montrose and Sammy have always had, right? Has it always been that way? Has it always been this notion of rough sex with them, up to the point where now maybe Montrose understands more so who he is after the ball scene, and we might start seeing a more maybe gentler Montrose, right? And maybe that's what this is
Drag
to.
queens. I'm sorry.
I guess I'm just a little cautious about using the word, about seeing that as violent, and more so this kind of perhaps that's the nature of the relationship.
Yes,
it's this roughness that happens between them sexually, possibly, right? And then tying that back into the I kind of wanted to go to the stiletto scene also, because I just saw for Ruby that being this moment of her coming to terms with these different identities, with these notions of power, race, gender, and class, and that anger. Of course, it was, you know, it was violent, and you know, in so much of everything. I mean, it's really difficult. Again, like I said, I watched the show a number of times, and every time that scene was coming up, I'm not going to watch it this time. But I found myself watching it because I think there's something so part of Ruby's metamorphosis, part of her coming out, part of her shedding that skin, is, I think, her coming to that realization. And I think all that anger there, I think, is meant to talk about that kind of intersections, those kind of, you know, her coming to terms with these notions finally of you know, no matter what she does, because remember when she's talking to the other black woman who works at the store, and finding out that she doesn't, you know, she only completed the 7th grade, you know, I think she's beginning to understand, you know, how powerless she is. And when she gives a speech about being a credit for your race, maybe she's starting to see that as BS. You know, her gender, the way that, you know, affects everything that she does, in class, right? And also, you know, the power between women and men at that moment, and you know, and I think that anger, and I think for me, I'm trying to put it in context of the realization of all that, and that anger coming out in the stiletto. I'm sorry, because the stiletto, you know, the stiletto's introduced in the show. Where's it in their break room, right? That's where we first see that pair of stilettos, right? And what she has to deal with then with those white women talking about, I can't remember the woman's name who's working on the floor, the black woman who's working, I can't remember her name.
Tammy?
Camera.
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 I think it was
Okay.
Tamara.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was on the whatchamacallit. It was Tamara, so Tamara or Tamara.
Yeah. And what she's having to deal with, and hearing these white women, right? Of course, you know, we hear the white version of Tutti Frutti by Elvis Presley, right? And she's dealing with all these notions of whiteness and race and gender and class and power there. And just the way I think that anger comes out in the stiletto in the assault scene. And, you know, yeah, it was very violent, but I just think there's, you know, I hate to say this, but the beauty of it for me was that she's coming to terms with, you know, what she's finding out now about being a black woman. especially in that era.
So,
No, I was just saying that I looked at that scene. I mean, I liked it. You know, because prior to that, you know, Christina was outlining that magic means, you know,
Yes.
power of magic is being able to do whatever the fuck you want, and she chose.
That was the whole point, right? That was the whole point. And that also has to do with her doing this metamorphosis on her own.
And, you know, assault this man, this would-be rapist.
Yeah.
And poor Tamara, poor girl. She's got this new job. She's surrounded by white people. She's got this predatory manager and this new crazy white woman.
Yeah.
It was yelling at her about closets.
1 minute, trying to help her the next.
Called her ass.
Fighting her, everybody in the South Side. Tamara, the whole show, she's like, what?
Called her ass. Called her ass.
In your head.
Like,
Ashy, like, oh my God. I was like, this poor child.
oh my God.
Yeah.
I love that about this show, that there's so many different types of horror. Like, everyone in the show is experiencing horror from a different perspective. So you've got this white man who thinks he rules the world, who just had a black woman rape him with a stiletto. You've got, you know, Tamara, who's having to live in this weird, you know, that whole thing. So I just feel like that's one thing I really appreciate, is that there's different types of horror being put together from different perspectives, and I can't help but root for some of the people inflicting that horror.
There you go.
I have 2 points to make. One I can make the other one later. We've been speaking a lot about Montrose and his anger and his desperation during this sexual encounter with Sammy. We have yet to discuss everything that happened before. We have not talked about Tick and Letty once.
Yeah.
Because I didn't get my turn yet.
Our performances by Woomy and Jamie Newman and Michael K. Williams were just amazing. I completely forgot about Tick and Letty. And the way that Tick just wailed on Montrose. I don't know.
Yeah.
I thought that there were, I mean, the growth, the change that we saw, right, in Montrose and Ruby, that just dominated the episode.
Right.
There was a change in Atticus and Letty, right? There was
Atticus lashing out once again. And I mean, they definitely delved into, they did confirm that obviously he has some PTSD issues, or a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, rather, from his time in the Korean War, but I really didn't care that much.
but it was really interesting. But it's really interesting though when he does say to Letty, "Please don't be scared of me."
Yeah,
man.
I think that's one of a really interesting scene where he has this there, because of course, you know, when she first comes down to the basement, he has that bad like, "I'm gonna take him out. I'm gonna take this man out," right? Because he's crazy. He is really acting out and trying to hit it and beat up everybody. He beat up his father. I know he might take a slug at me, right? But in that, I think this that tenderness. I'm not sure if that's in the when he says that when she's in the bathtub, or if he says that beforehand, where he says, you know, because she says, "Seeing that side of you scares me." When he says, "Please don't be scared of me," and so you wonder, you know.
The
all
thing
that
is,
happened this week, right? And all that craziness that, you know, I'm still trying to work through with this episode. Was that the gentle part of the show, to make us see that we're going to see that there is this gentle side of Tick, beyond that he went through as a child, right? And you know, and the abuse he went through as a child, and then all he went through, you know, during the war, right? That, you know, maybe Letty is the one thing that is going to center him in some way.
well, that language of someone who's, I think I can say he's been violent, right? So for someone in a relationship to be violent and then to not be in the moment of violence and then to come back and say, "Please don't be scared of me." I'm sorry, but that's diagnostic, right? That's fear doesn't happen. Fear is not something you can help yourself from developing, right? I mean, if someone's in your face and you see someone doing the things he's doing, you can't help. It's an automatic association. And so I thought it was interesting that what this means is that this relation, I don't know, they imply he was in love in Korea, so I don't know. But I hope that they don't put the burden of saving him on Letty, right? I hope that she doesn't have to be this goddess that provide. I mean, like maybe one could say that's what love does. I don't know, but I hope that her story continues as well, and what she wants continues as well, and that she tells him no, and she tells him, no, we're not going in that direction. So I hope that plays out that way. But I have to say, when I think about it, that actually was my favorite line of the episode. Please don't be afraid of me or scared of me, because that's
No,
And also, is there some manipulation at play? Because Tick's reaction was to the fact that Montrose murdered Yahima.
Mm-hmm.
He killed them, I mean, I guess to protect his family, but there really were no consequences to that, because almost immediately Montrose became this really sympathetic character. I was hoping that we would delve a little deeper into Yahima, that we would see Yahima again. I guess that's not going to happen. So they are quite literally dead and buried, I guess. And I find that really, really disappointing.
Well, what are we in episode 5? I mean, they told one story about Montrose in episode 4. Now they gave us a different version, a different take on Montrose in episode 5. I wouldn't be surprised to see these, you know, I'm just
wondering if whether or not Yahima is going to pop up again. That's my concern. Or if we've gotten what we need from that character and they were really just...
Well, you know, it's not to push corny metaphors, but, you know, skeletons in the closet, right? We are watching, you know, kind of a ghost story, and I wouldn't be surprised if she comes back and...
Speaking of which, skeletons in closets, I know I'm jumping around, I'm sorry, and I'm coming out of the room. Ruby, in that closet, with that man, with the corruption running out of his neck, that was rough. I just want to say that. It was very, very hard to watch. And why was Lancaster's torso that of a black man?
It was some Get Out type shit going on.
Like, really was.
Well, it is, yo, like,
not just that. But we paused it, and when we paused it on the guy with the black torso, and when we paused it, you could see that there were staples connecting the black and the white skin. Yep. So I think we're going to be doing. I think we're going to be doing some sort of Frankenstein episode pretty soon. And then the guy in the closet. In something I read, they mentioned that his tongue had been torn out, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if the people in the closet aren't people that he's taking body parts from.
Oh my
Absolutely. God. We did the same thing. We paused it. I love that we paused the same scene. I completely think he's taking stuff from them.
Oh, that's awful.
Bruce Creeper style.
So do you think he's trying to cover up black skin with white skin?
I do now.
Because you're right, because you can see the staple. Yeah.
I do now.
Yeah.
I also love, by the way, my favorite scene is actually when Ruby's having that little bit of a breakdown with Tamara over the pumps, and she was like, and next thing you know, you're sitting in a closet with some, and, you know, and like everyone else is watching her. Like, I just love that moment of like, you have to, like, it all kind of like starts to catch up with her. Mm-hmm. And that closet scene was like, again, at this point, I was still rooting for William to be an accomplice. So the fact that he put her in a position in a maid's outfit and then she ends up in this situation was really disappointing for me. And then, well, of course, it makes sense later. But I'm with you. That whole thing was like heart stopping.
Wow.
The whole thing with, my favorite line was Ruby towards the end when she says to Christina, "You've been William the whole fucking time," because it answers so many questions. I mean, and presents a whole bunch of new questions. But she kind of said what I've been thinking for the past 3 or 4 episodes. Like, what is the magic? How does the magic work? he's conjuring butterflies. William slash Christina conjures butterflies. Has this metamorphosis potion. But he's still very reliant on Letty and Ruby and Atticus to carry out these tasks that seem pretty menial. I mean, did you really need her to go through all that just to put a rock in a drawer? And someone's like, I just don't understand what the limitations of the magic, what are the limitations of this magic? And it's really, really, really frustrating. It's really, really, because it double backs on itself so many times.
Picking up on what Cianna said earlier about understanding the magic, right? So Christina / William has this potion that allows him, her to transform into they, them, he, she, or it, right? And at that point, it doesn't make sense for Christina to be walking around like, oh, it's tough being a woman, because she doesn't have to be. Like she has the potion that gives her the freedom to like be a part of any subject position and take the distinct powers from every individual subject position to the point where she should, if you have that, then you should never feel oppressed. You should be able to walk into any circumstance and metamorphosize into that thing that optimizes your position within the context.
Well,
and she's been doing that, yet she's still running around complaining about how hard her life is.
But there's one place where she doesn't do that though, with Lancaster. She can't let, this is why I think William really is dead. Or, I mean, if he's not dead, then there's some kind of powerlessness that she feels that even William would have with Lancaster. And I guess Lancaster was the one, if the story is true, what she said is that Lancaster shot or had William killed, right? And so I wonder, you know, does she have that power in all circumstances, in all situations? Is there a feeling of not having that power with Lancaster and with the other people?
Well, it feels to me like it's all an okie doke. She's in whatever space he or she needs to be in to maximize advantage. And while it is a changeling, they at least need a broom closet to flay all the old skin. I mean, it doesn't have. So that was one of the rules of the magic. I think they sort of revealed this episode. And that just adds force to Ruby's agency to go through that in the alley, right? To just shed that skin right there and then. That was some of the best horror cinematography I've seen in a long time. It was incredibly well done.
And she actually pushes the skin. You see her, this is the time she's pushing that skin off of herself, right? She's going through that metamorphosis and helping it at this point, right? It's almost like, I want to be both of these and I'm going to do them on my term, right? I want this skin off of me now. And I think that it's so different than when we see it happening the first time, right? Where William has to keep pulling her and he actually has to take the knife and cut the skin away. And when she runs to the elevator and the skin's coming in, you know, the metamorphosis is happening. In that alley, she's tearing that skin off herself. She's peeling that skin away. I think that this episode is so full of, we see so much whiteness going on, right? We see white men, we see white women, we see Hillary walking through the city, right, in a sea of whiteness. And I'm just wondering, you know, we're thinking about, you know, Cianna, I love that, you know, this question of, you know, what's the magic, right? And I wonder if the magic is disappearing into the sea of whiteness. I don't know. I'm just being metaphorical here, but it's just something. There's so much in this episode. I think where we see so much whiteness going on, whiteness in the store, right? White women shopping in the store, white women working in the store, a white version of Tutti Frutti, whiteness going into the black bar, right?
Yeah.
There's so much with whiteness there. And so
And this theme that runs throughout, this thread of white control over Black bodies that has run throughout the entire show. I thought the most horrific scene was Ruby's first metamorphosis, when the cops drop her off at William's house, and the way he just rips her body open and just drags her to the center of the living room, and it was just so violent and so horrific and so cold. I really hate Christina. I think Christina / they are the worst. I have no, and she will never be a sympathetic character. I don't believe that, again, that this battle between Letty and Tick and Ruby, they are not on equal footing. Christina holds all the cards, and I'm very, very interested into where it goes from here.
It is that Aryan power. I mean, William and Christina, that
the
is
way she cradled that monster that she delivered, and contrast that to the way she was handling Ruby. It's just
So let me follow up on that, and because after Ruby rips off the skin, she runs into Christina later, and that's the whole scene where, you're not William. And Christina says to Ruby, "You misunderstood William's gift." So the question I have is, what does Christina have to gain by Ruby then using this power? That's the one thing I've seen about Christina William, where there's no play being made for Christina Williams' behalf when the red stiletto scene happens, right? In other words, Christina does say to her, "You misunderstood William's gift." This is, and I don't remember the exact quote, "Oh, the currency of magic is that you can do what the frack you want," right?
Well, Christina having that potion, maybe that is, Christina's currency. Getting Ruby hooked on that power and being able to use her.
Okay, that could be
whatever she wants.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's her getting her on her side of the line, and getting her feeling obligated to her, or winning her over, right? Being friends, but also using you.
Right. The double-edged sword of that one. Yeah. No, the double-edged sword of that one is, you're right, and then Ruby's going to use it against her. Right. I mean, okay, fine. I can choose to do what I want. I have magic. Well, you're gone. I mean, I suspect that'll be.
She's pushing Ruby. I mean, she's pushing Ruby because throughout that episode, we hear uninterrupted a number of times, right? And so I think she's pushing Ruby. Christina's pushing Ruby with this notion of, who are you? And, that's the end of that line where she says, "That's the currency of magic, unmitigated freedom. Who are you really, uninterrupted?" Right? So, is this, Christina saying, this is this currency of magic here, right? This is this power of the magic that you now can be this person or these persons uninterrupted. These things that you want, these things that you probably should have the right to have anyway. That's why I'm so fascinated with this episode. Again, I think it's really playing on this notion of, Burke wrote this article called Hitler's rhetoric, right? And the way Hitler, talked about the body, right? And the ugliness of bodies other than the rightful people, right? The disease of the body. Right, and it's just something that, and I haven't figured this out yet, because I think this is something I actually want to write about with this show, is this playing around with this kind of Hitler-esque, I think, theme that's going through here throughout this, throughout this episode. And it would be just about this episode, but this notion of, again, going back to this whiteness, but not even all those other forms of whiteness are the same kind of whiteness as William and Christina. Right? There's this more powerful than any other whiteness, because I think those other white bodies are completely disposable in this episode. That's why that store manager, that's why he's tortured. His body is completely disposable, right? And I think Christina knows, that if I give her this power, because I don't care about these other white bodies. I really don't think William and Christina care about the other white bodies in this show. I think Christina
Ooh,
really
that's
just
fantastic.
pairs whoever that really is, William or Christina, because I'm not really sure yet which one
True.
really is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
True.
Mhm.
That everything is expendable to them.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's very, yep. Okay. I got an issue on this show I want to ask you guys about. We saw a lot of backsides in this episode, right? And they're not showing Ruby's body. And I want to know why Ruby's body isn't being shown in the same ways other people's bodies are.
Hmm.
We see Ruby's backside in this scene where she's ripping white skin off of herself. That's the only time we see her backside, and we briefly see it. Now, you may think, Scott, you're a creepy old man. What are you doing looking for a woman's backside? But the point is, what they're doing in the show is presenting you what they think they want you to see. And why do they want us to see this? And it's not that I was bothered, like, damn it, but I'm thinking, why? Full on with Letty. Why full on with Atticus? Why do we get to see William's right behind? Why do we see all this? And we don't see Ruby's body in a sexual way being sexual.
No, I thought about that. And to me, it still, again, ties into the whole notion of Marshall Fields of the store. And to me, I think that, you know, and I'm being presumptuous here, but I wonder, are they playing around with the notion of beauty standards purposely in this show?
Wumi Masako is like breathtakingly beautiful.
Yes.
She's the most beautiful person on this show.
Yeah.
She's gorgeous.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I think that I hate to use this term, but the saltiness of, you know, one of my favorite scenes was when she was in that bar singing and no one applauded.
Well, F you too.
Well, that dress that she has on,
Yes.
the way that hits her, I absolutely love that. I'm like, good Lord, I would love to be able to do a performance in that dress and have that,
Yes.
you know, that exposure, right? But I think for me, and I think it's a great question, Scott, I think it's a little, I'm hopeful here that they're playing around with the notion of beauty standards.
I hope so too.
We see so much. Remember, we even, you know, and when they're in the Marshall Fields scene where Hilary Davenport is talking to Tamara about the shoes, right? To the side of that is a white woman modeling an outfit, right? And so I think we're really playing around with these standards, you know, or I hope they're playing around with these standards of what was seen as beautiful. Because there's another scene where someone has, I hope I'm thinking about the right show, a Jet or Ebony magazine posted like in the background. There was a lot of background stuff in this episode, right? With the television shows, different wall hangings. And I believe there was something in the background, but for me, it was just about, I think, playing around with this notion of you know, of beauty standards, specifically, you know, that would have, you know, been a part of the culture in that time, right? Which is, you know, we still have these notions, these messed up notions of beauty in this culture. But I wonder if that's what they're playing around with on purpose. I can't, you know, I can't imagine that, how do you say it? Is it Misha?
Misha Green?
Misha Green, and especially with Cheryl Dunye there, that would be acceptable for them not to, you know, for that to be like a hidden thing. I just think it has for me, I think it has a thematic purpose. Maybe that's, you know, maybe more meta than.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. The scene on the staircase last week, like, I actually was like, oh, I haven't seen a heavyset woman have really passionate sex like that before on TV. So I think my reaction was the opposite. Although now that you bring my attention to it, does that make sense? For like, now that you say that, yeah, I also felt like that scene in the bar with the dress. Like, I was like, I wish I was confident enough to do that. Maybe I am. Like, I don't know. I think Byron's onto something. I think they might be playing around with that a little bit. But I also wanted to say that, like, I hear what you're saying. And I also feel like I've watched it and been like, oh, wow, like, now I can see myself being on the stairs.
I feel the same exact way, Leandra. You never see women with large busts naked in film or on TV. And it makes me feel like there's actually something very offensive about your body.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally understand how you feel, and I understand your concern, Scott. I'm hoping that maybe it's because the actress opted out of doing a nude scene for the show. I'm hoping that's what it is. I've seen her in a few other TV shows and films, but I don't think I haven't seen her do nudity in any of the other work that she's been in. So I'm hoping that's what it is. But yeah, absolutely. You really never see a full-figured woman, especially, or, a full-figured woman of color naked on screen.
Right.
Yeah, but to add to your point, I mean, they could have done the same. They could have still brought in a body double for that, and they've done that in other shows, and they've done that. It appears that they may have even done that with Letty's character, right? So there are ways in which they could have gotten around it if it's a contractual issue. But I think that this is also I attribute this a little bit to the anthology light format, right? Where they have they actually have different people behind the cameras for the different episodes. And I felt like I did feel very much like Ruby's body was just handled so much differently in the last episode versus this episode, right? Because like the scene, like when she with her in the round bed, I actually really liked that scene. I liked it because there's a sense of openness to it. Like right now, a lot of the nudity has been. It hasn't been a relaxed kind of experience, right? And I love that sense of relaxation. I thought the scene where she was in the bathtub and William came up and started sponging her off. I thought that was a really interesting scene, right? Because there's still tenderness around her form.
Mm-hmm.
And I like, and that's the one thing I liked about it. But I do agree with you that is that they didn't deal with her body with the same level of, what's the word I'm looking for? I want to say gratuitousness, but
openness.
We didn't see her butt. We didn't see, and we seem to see everyone else's behind.
We found a reason to get tick naked again.
Yeah.
As always, my answers are prayer. Like my prayers are answered. Like.
Well, but that's the thing, is the contrasts were so stark, right? If we hadn't had all the other exposed bodies in the episode, and then it was clear in the cinematography they were working very hard to have you see certain things, that level of effort, you have to ask. For me, I had to ask myself why. And to Byron, if I say that I'm hopeful, I'm hopeful, right? I mean, the way they dealt with gay love in this episode was fantastic. I think it was. And maybe there's other forms and people of love that they need to also do that same uplifting for. I'm not making the show. I'm just saying the contrast in this one, particularly is regarding Ruby's body, for me, rather stark and made me think, why not?
I have a quick question. Ruby and William's sexual tryst, I mean, that was sexual assault, right? I mean, that's a form of sexual assault. If she was really Christina, I mean, was that consensual?
That's true. There can't be consent if you don't know what you're consenting to.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's a little bit of a Uther Pendragon situation, right? Where you...
Right.
It makes
Well-
me a little queasy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of came out of Ruby's question. You've been in the whole time.
Yeah, I think it would come down to whether or not Ruby feels like it was. You know, like we all like. Does she? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, we'll see if they explore that, right? We'll see if they explore how Ruby felt about that scene. And because I actually think there's a lot of narrative force being put on her character. I really do think there's a very centering aspect to her character that they're really going to rely on to tell the rest of the story. I have one other question. Was that a Jill Scott song they played when Hillary was walking through town? Sing a black girl song?
That was
sounded like Jill Scott.
That was Entozaka Shange's For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough.
It's a
Was Jill Scott reading the
play
poem?
it was on Broadway, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Yeah, and it was on Broadway.
And
yeah.
it got a terrible Tyler Perry remake.
Yes. Yeah, I mean that scene was fantastic,
Beautiful.
right? To take that, talking Shange's
Mhm.
words and put that with, you know, while we're seeing this white woman walk through whiteness, right? Walk uninterrupted through whiteness, right? And that's a big part of that play is, you know, these women having to deal with these interrupted lives, right? And so we see with this, you know, we see Hilary Davenport being able to be uninterrupted, right?
Yes.
As she walks freely through Chicago, right?
Fantastic.
So, whereas the black women in that play's lives were constantly being interrupted.
And to that point, who again, they continue to slay the soundtrack. We got not one but two Cardi songs in this. Child, I was like, what? I was so excited. Oh my God.
I have to tell you.
And they were fitting.
Yes,
Oh my God.
when that beat dropped for Money, I was like, oh my God, I was so excited. I forgot.
My wife and I were
And
watching.
someone said,
Go ahead, man. Go ahead.
no, just someone said on one of the websites that the music's just so stupid in this. I'm like, are we watching the same show?
No, they're ignorant.
My wife and I were watching it Sunday night, and my 19-year-old walks in and says, "Why are you guys listening to Cardi B?" I said, "Come watch the show with us." No, I'm not going to watch that show. Well,
That's Tegan and Marissa.
oh, it was Tegan.
Yeah.
And wait, we've got to talk about Shangela. Shangela showing up in the drag scene too. In that scene, that was absolutely wonderful.
That was epic.
HBO said we're going to take Shangela from We're Here and put you in this show also, which was just wonderful. And if you haven't seen We're Here on HBO, you should watch it. Beautiful stories.
Stanford.
Well, yeah, I mean, one thing that I was thinking of, and this is in reference to when Atticus says, you know, please don't be scared of me, right? Is I completely saw, you know, what all of you described in terms of like, you know, he had been violent, right? He had done things that made it understandable that someone would be afraid of him. But there's a moment when right after he said that line where I was thinking to myself, that's the thing that I said when I was a boy. And that's the thing that's actually very much a black boy thing. You know, when you're moving through spaces, when you're deprived of the ability to be young, to be a child, and especially if you're a black boy moving through white spaces, you know, where you're just seen as a threat. I thought that was, I mean, that was one of the things that I read in there, along with the other narratives, and that actually is one of the things that that's one of the things that I thought was really impactful about that moment, was that it had me torn between recognizing his violence and also recognizing that, and even when I, you know, quite frankly, when I think of when I think of the many Black boys that have been killed, right? You know, I sometimes I wonder if that's what they were, what was going through their head, you know. And so I think there's a lot there's a lot still to be unpacked around that moment and around Tick, and I get the irony, given that I have not necessarily been Tick's biggest fan.
Now that's go ahead.
I'm so happy that you just said that, because I feel like when he said that, please don't be scared of me, that's exactly where my mind went, because Black men are like public enemy number one in America. And it's like, I felt that when, like, because he grabbed her hand and you saw like his like bloody knuckles, and he was like, please don't be scared of me. And I was like, he's not talking to her, he's talking to everyone. You know what I'm saying? Because he then talked about how before he went to war, like I was cool, and then I went to war to defend a country that now fears me because y'all turned me into this by sending me to a war, and then like I'm coming back here and there's nothing for me here, and y'all racist as hell. You know what I'm saying? It's just like that. I agree with you 100%, Stanford. I feel like there was so much power in just that one line, and his face, and I am his biggest fan. I'm biased, like the abs, they blind me, and I ain't gonna lie about it. You know, he's a great actor though, you know, that aside. So, I feel you.
Yeah, those are really good points. And I think it goes in with the theme of the interrupted, uninterrupted life also, right? Because as this boy, you know, like you were talking about Stanford, as a young Black boy, I mean, your life is interrupted all the time because of how you're perceived, right? And I think, once again, that's this brilliance of working with this notion. And I hadn't even put that together with any of the men in this
boy
episode.
In the opening scene,
right?
when Hillary was walking with the popcorn.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely, right? And we're still, you know, Bobo was still showing up, and it wasn't in this episode, but he's still showing up in these other episodes, right? And you wonder when you get to the point where he's no longer in these episodes, but you know, it is this notion of these interrupted lives, right? This Black innocent boys walking down the street with popcorn, right? Or Skittles, right? So these lives interrupted constantly. And you're right. I think that, you know, that scene really is touching on that notion of you know, this violence that's done to Black men's bodies, and you know, having to say that, don't be scared of me, right? Yeah, definitely.
I gotta say, this is a great conversation. Because I have to admit, I experienced that scene as a personal scene between Atticus and Letty first, and what I was focusing on is what he was asking of her. That's what I was focusing on when I watched the scene. And now hearing you talk about it, there's another side even to that personal level, and that is this plea for, I don't want to be what you're seeing, right? And I can imagine if you're going to be a person in a chain of trauma, a chain of violence, who's going to be the person who breaks it? It's just an incredible amount of conscious deliberation and effort you have to go through every day to not do the hitting, to not do the yelling. And so you had, from this conversation, I'm seeing that same scene, even at a personal level, from a different sort of angle, as a sort of plea. And then it speaks to the richness of the love that the two of them are developing. And the fact that all these different levels are there is just testament to the writing and the acting.
It was a very peaceful scene. And I think what you brought up, I didn't even think about it in the moment of, he's watched his father be violent, so I'm sure he knows what it's like to have a woman look at you in fear. And sort of that intergenerational trauma that goes along with that. I liked that scene. It didn't have much going on for it, other than I love Letty giving him that look when he starts talking about another woman. Like, really? Like, right now is when you start talking about this other woman? Anyway. But I did find it was a nice, needed, peaceful break with the bathtub scene. Even if it was heavy stuff, you know, it wasn't going very quickly.
But it's a moment of healing, and it may be one. The question is, do they have more, right? That's the, if you've been traumatized and you're trying to develop a relationship where that trauma is not going to dominate how the relationship goes, you just have to have more and more of that healing space. So we'll see. Leandra, you said you had a comment as well.
Yeah, I think mine was the favorite quote, and it's very, very quick. It's actually the very last thing when Atticus says, "What are you?" Because in the previous episode, when Montross says, "What are you?" he reframes it as, "Who are you?" Like he changes it from what to who because he recognizes humanity and, you know, being a person. And I think that Atticus will serve, I'm thinking, we've all talked kind of like Atticus is kind of like a blank slate a little bit, like he just kind of goes with the flow. But he's really good at seeing the humans from the monsters, and he's starting to realize, and he says, like, what are you? Because he recognizes that this person wasn't entirely human. And so I'm interested to see where they go with that. And his, like, even with Montross, like, he realizes right away, you killed that woman. Like, he sees people for what they are. And I didn't realize it until he picks up the phone. And I just felt like that was a very interesting decision on the writer's part to have it throw back to that who are you, what are you conversation from the previous episode.
That also goes back to the first episode where Atticus was the seer and the others were under a spell, right? And when you throw that into the Stanford's interpretation of what won't be scared of me meant, right? He's seen crystal clear, not through his own life, but our life, right? And you can almost see him as reacting to all these different scales of who he's talking to. And if that's what he ends up doing for the show, it's fantastic, right? Vanessa, you had a couple of comments.
It actually goes with what Leandra just said about intergenerational trauma, because one thing I appreciated about the development of Montross in this scene, or this episode, is that we sort of get to see this juxtaposition between even the lovemaking scenes in this episode. Like even Tick and Letty's lovemaking scene, it like comes out of this like, you know, like they were just doing whatever. And then I also think that the opening scene with Tick basically beating his dad's ass, you know, like it was, you see that trauma, I mean, manifesting before our very eyes with the violence, with this sort of like emotional unavailability. And with, I think, the sort of torturedness, I don't know if that's a word, but I feel like that's one thing for me that the sort of, what we saw with Montross, it's kind of like, dang, like they have so many similarities. And again, some good, some bad. I use those terms loosely. But I think that the way that in this episode specifically, we got to see a lot of those literally like side by side. And I just think that that was awesome. And I think that, again, it adds dimension to both of them. I tend to like characters that are complicated and it's like clear cut. It's not clear cut. Like I hate Christina is the only person like, I don't like you. There's not like, I'm with Cianna. Nothing you can do, go away. But I think everyone else besides her is so complex and complicated. And I just think that that's, I think I said this last week, it's such a, I think an accurate representation of everyday, like just us. Every day, we're all complicated. We're not clear cut. You know, I mean, some people are. Like the worst.
Going off of, I'm sorry, I apologize.
No, you go ahead. No.
Piggybacking off of what Byron had said earlier about how there was so much whiteness in this episode, I think they missed a trick and an opportunity. Well, I mean, hindsight is 20/20 to sort of. Hillary has a really interesting experience when she's with her other white female coworkers, and you can see how uncomfortable she is, obviously because she's Ruby, masquerading as a white woman about Black people negatively. And I think it really does speak to what the stakes were and are for progressive white people in that time and today who understand racial violence, racial terror, and who want to speak out against it, but you know, the stakes are also really high for them. Were Hillary Davenport an actual woman who maybe had a family? I mean, is it worth losing your job, being ostracized in your community and in your workplace, to speak out on behalf of, you know, the African American community, or to put your job on the line for a single Black employee in an organization that is, you know, overwhelmingly white. And I think, you know, looking at what happened over the summer, or what's continuing to happen with so many white people participating in Black Lives Matter protests across the country, I think they could have delved a little deeper into that. They kind of glazed over it, but I thought that scene was incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of the scene too, where he asked her how she feels about working with someone of color, and she gives like they deserve the same chance we do, and he just kind of dismisses her and moves on. It makes it very clear that's not the status quo. And so I think that's an interesting point about kind of like she's starting to realize
the limits to,
the limits to that. And then you have Christina with her fabulous magic, and so, you know, what are you gonna do? But I did think that was an interesting scene, and I remember watching that and being like, oh, like he didn't hear what he wanted to hear, and he shut her down.
Yeah. I love the way it addresses what I'll just call contextual power, right? And recognizing what the options are in that moment, and then power matters, right? And being able to tell people, no, we're going in this direction, without the repercussions a supervisee would go through if they were saying. I think drawing our attention to those contextual levels of power is just terribly important, because most people live in a level of power and maybe resent power they have, or have power and they don't know that they can use it. And just drawing our attention to how power plays out at these different levels is just narratively very important, because it provides us an opportunity to live life in these different levels of power playing out.
That reminds me of Buffy. My favorite quote from that is, it's not about good, it's not about bad, it's about who has the power. Like, it's basically,
that is not trivial.
All of that.
That
Joss
is not
didn't realize what he was saying when he said it, but he said it.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny, real quick. It's just funny that this conversation about Hillary Davenport, because, you know, it's funny, you think about the music, you know, this juxtaposition, you know, between Cardi B, and if you notice, remember the song at the beginning that's playing when the police put Hillary in the patrol car?
Shout out to American Horror Story.
Tonight You Belong to Me, by Patience and Prudence, right? And so you have this you know, this juxtaposition between Cardi B, right, and you know, Patience and Prudence, I guess, were these two, were they mother and daughter or something? One was younger, one was older, I think, the two women. But you know, to have that play between, you know, these two songs, and that you know, because Hillary is going to be taken back to that community, right, where she's, again, if this were a regular story, right, it would be this white woman being taken back to her husband in this upper middle class community, right, where her voice would probably be shut down, right, if she's speaking out or speaking up for, you know, Tamara or Black folk in general, if she's more progressive, right, that when she would, you know, the return to that community probably would shut her up. And that's why I like that play in that music with, you know, with having, and you're right. So yes, yeah, that song was in American Horror Story.
Murder House.
What was it? Murder House. Yeah, right.
It was like the first scene of the first series.
Yeah.
It's really, really interesting that you picked up on the music, though, because I mean, they packed so much into these episodes. So in that same scene, when Hillary and her co-workers are in that back room, and Hillary starts dancing, and they make reference to, you know, you could be on the Herb Mintz show or the colored version or something like that, which for that time, there were all these, you know, very popular teen dance party shows. And even dancing, you know, was very, very segregated. You did not see white teenagers in the same light, sort of carefree, allowing to exist in that, being allowed to exist in that space of dancing and music. It was very, very, those teen dance party shows, they were very, very political. I mean, in Hairspray, what was the Corny Collins? Was that the show?
Yeah.
The Corny
Corny
Collins show,
Collins.
which was actually based off of an actual dance party show in Baltimore called The Buddy Dean Show. And when that show was sort of faced with integration, I just finished a book by a historian who talks about race and culture in media and how they define cities. She was talking about how the Buddy Dean Show, you know, when faced with the question of integrating their show as the city of Baltimore was being integrated, they just shut the show down. You know, it wasn't a question. You could not have, you know, teen superstars and teen role models who were African American. So I just thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah.
I got one comment I want to make in response to what Vanessa said about a generational trauma, because one thing that we're seeing in this episode is the intergenerational trauma that Atticus is going through. And at the same time, we're also seeing him have Letty there with him in that space. And it goes back to what Stanford said about Montrose's wife, right? Or Atticus's mother. We haven't seen her yet. So we don't know what were the spaces available to Montrose in his life as when he was Atticus's age. It's almost as if the ball was one of those spaces where finally his trauma had a space to express itself non-violently. And it makes you think, this poor guy's this age and has never had a space to suffer, or at least that's the implication. So it bodes for them giving us more backstory on Atticus's mother, I think.
It also forces us to really re-examine Atticus as a child as we learn more about Montrose, right? So when we have the reveal that Montrose isn't really Atticus's dad, you know, it's kind of like it kind of raised this question about George. Like, George, how, you know, what's up with George? You stepped out with your brother's wife
on my hippo,
right?
like, how did you do that? Sorry, I'm very upset about that. Actually, it's a hidden stressor for me that he cheated on her.
Right, but I'm also thinking in terms of him stepping out on his brother's wife as well. But now all of a sudden it's like okay, so Montrose is with Sammy, right? And we don't know how long that relationship with Sammy has been going, but
right.
It's hinted at that it's been going on for a while, right? So it just
everyone's cheating on this woman.
Well, is it?
Everyone's cheating.
Is it about everybody cheating on somebody, or is this about sort of the secrets and the different types of relationships that are happening, right? So now I'm wondering, well, okay, as we start asking this question, what was the marriage like between Montrose and Atticus's mom? Well, where did Sammy fit into that?
See, I'm getting the impression the way they told the story that that in fact Montrose's trauma and his having to deal with it alone may have, in a sense, forced his wife into George's arms. Trauma, man, that kind of trauma can destroy relationships 30 years later, right? It doesn't go away. And you learn how to manage it, but it's not like you don't have trauma, right? So if you don't have a space, if you don't have coaches, if you don't have a space where you can somehow express your suffering be given the opportunity to manage it, you can just be horrible to people and not know that you're ruining the opportunities you have. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that's how it played out, right? That she just, Atticus's mother just couldn't be with Montrose anymore. But I have no idea. How about we read some viewer feedback? Cole, anyone have a final comment? All right, here we go. Here we go. Oh, I got to read. So I got to look over here to read, so don't think I'm ignoring you. So Victor Johnson says, I'm really loving this new show, and I'm trying to take in a lot of different conversations about it, and I appreciate your show podcast. Although I'm biased by your wonderful host, Byron, my uncle, I will continue to add you guys to my watch listen list. Thank you for a great conversation. Thank you much, Victor. All right.
My nephew is a podcaster, so he's in disbelief that I'm actually doing this. So
That's amazing.
You're
I love
inspiring,
it.
and that's awesome. And then E11 E11 MAC 22 says, yes, Dr. Craig.
You've got a fan club.
Oh, let me see. And then E11 iMac 22 then says 5 clap hands. Okay. And
I love that you're being shy, Byron, by the way. You're like, oh, no. These are your people.
So then we have a question, and this is from MLN asks, what is Christina's objective? Who is moaning in the closet? Do you think Hippolyta knows that Uncle George is Tick's real daddy? Answers.
I think the last one, yes. I think she knows.
Yeah.
I don't know why I do, but I think that she knows for sure, because Black women know everything.
There you go. All right, then E11 iMac 22 writes in again. Why did Montrose kill the two-spirit person? Is he a bad guy?
I think it's his interpretation of protection. Again, I think he thinks that Tick is getting too into this. Like, you know, he's doing all this stuff. He thinks he can use magic. But I think that Montrose is not as confident in Tick's magic as Tick is confident in magic. So he was like, nope. That's just my two.
No, fantastic. Anyone else?
Why kill the most vulnerable person?
Yeah, that was my question on that.
Damn.
Like, why?
I just,
Like,
we should all be concentrating our efforts on taking Christina down.
Well,
our focus and energy should be, committed to taking Christina down. Hema didn't do anything to anyone.
You're right. If you're going to go into the forest and you're going to kill something, you can't say much if all you kill is Bambi.
Right.
No, the thing is, we don't. Go ahead, Leandra. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, like, I think part of it is that they have the answer, right? And I think that so there's a whole section of time where he's at Ardham without anyone else. We don't know what really happened to him, or like why he started down this journey to like go find these people. And so something's happened to make him so scared that he wants to protect his son to the point that he's willing to just nonchalantly kill someone on the off chance that they will lead him to the answers that he's looking for. Like, he's constantly burning stuff that would be helpful. And I think too, like, he doesn't like what he doesn't understand. And I think some of that comes out of like that first question of what are you? And he's not going to take a chance. It's his kid. He's not going to risk it.
But maybe, or maybe he knows what Atticus is. I mean, and that's something that we haven't really talked about, right? Is that, he went on a quest to find out about Atticus's mom.
Yep.
Right? And if you think about it, the best way to really find out what Atticus is, not who Atticus is, but what Atticus is. Because once you know that, then you know what the plans are around Atticus. Atticus could be something where Atticus finding out the magic just sets him up to be a sacrificial lamb for something. And that's and it may be great for everyone else, but Atticus
What
is the
role
only,
does
you know,
Yahima play
Atticus,
in that? I
Atticus
don't
doesn't get to
understand.
see the promised land.
I don't
What?
understand what role Yahima played in that. I don't understand. It still just doesn't make sense.
Because she has the ability to translate
Atticus
the
is
book.
determined. Atticus was always going to find out what his role is. He's going to try his damnedest to understand this magic and destroy it.
I thought it was.
I think the stakes were lowest with the. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And to kill his two-spirited person and then be up in the ball.
And I actually did have a huge problem with that.
I didn't understand it. It just, I don't know. As much as I do like Montrose, he killed someone, y'all.
They're gonna have to provide some sort of answer for why that was somehow necessary or necessary from his point of view. Because you're right, like he just goes in there and he put what really freaked me out, and I wasn't here last week, so if you talked about this, I'm sorry, but the way he put his hand on their shoulder before he did it, like the whole thing was, I don't know, like he knew this was a vulnerable person who'd been through so much and still did it. So it kind of begs the question, if he does know something about Atticus, it must be something big.
And the translation was from an actual indigenous language. It's not like he can't, access that translation from another source. So I'm gonna need some context there.
See, I thought it was a trauma kill. I think he knows a lot more about the evilness of Ardham than any of the other characters. He's the one that knows that there are 34 lodges. This is the first magical being that we've seen him in the presence of, and for me it was like, oh hell no, I know where this is going and I'm going to end it. That's the vibe I got, because like you said, he was it was very intentional how he handled that whole thing. It's like he'd been planning it. Once he saw this being, he's like, oh no, this can't go on. That's the vibe I got.
Or is it like Letty says, it's that stuff, it makes you evil.
Yes.
Yes.
Mention of Letty saying that, right? And that's as far as that went. So, I wonder if there's something more diabolical behind Montrose's action there,
But we saw it in the second episode, right? I mean, what does Christina's father want Montrose to be? The sacrificial lamb to open the portal. Like, the portal doesn't get open unless it comes at Atticus's expense, right? Montrose knows it. And what I think is interesting is that, like, Atticus knows it. I'm surprised he's even going on the journey. It's like all of the knowledge, everything he knows right now tells him that the journey puts him on the altar, and it's not to get married. It's to end things, and it's to end things for other people. And I think that I actually find that interpretation to be really interesting in terms of Montrose, like that we have a father-son, and we're, whether we like it or not, we're in a relatively Christian country. This idea that the father knows that the son is being set up for sacrifice and is like, hell no, that's actually really transgressive of one of the major narratives that dominates our culture, right? This idea that we would like give up our, not just like, hell no. I find that to be interesting, but at the same time, it doesn't. I don't see how it rationalizes killing Bambi. I mean, I just come back to that. I come back to like there are certain things that you do, but that, I mean, there are a lot of there. You literally could have sent her away.
All right, then we're going to go to our next viewer feedback. This is from Min Montine Miller, who's someone I know who is a fantastic dancer. Great commentary and insights in this podcast. Looking forward to listening to future episodes. Thumbs up. So thank you, Min Montine Miller. Thank you for writing in.
Yeah, I'll give you the thumbs up my son gives, because for some reason his thumbs up are this. So his kindergarten teacher's always like, thumbs up if you did it. And he's like, what is that? Anyway, so yeah, thumbs up.
All right. So this one comes from a guy I know, a friend of mine, Will from the Sea, or should I say Will from Seatown. He's William Gould who lives out in Seattle. Says, this is probably about episode 4. The episode had an Indiana Jones meets Stephen King feel in the Hunt for the Pages arc. I was very excited at the possible storyline. Inyahima presented at the fates of her people, and the Freemans and very disappointed when Montrose killed her, and probably the storyline, as we were just saying.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. He mentioned Stephen King. I will say Stephen King falls into the same traps that Lovecraft does in a kind of a different way. It would be so interesting to see someone do the same thing with Stephen King's works, where they flip it. You know what I mean? Like he's constantly relying. Well, we've talked about that before, but
well, I don't know if everyone else has heard you talk about it.
Oh, Stephen King and his overuse of the magical black person.
Right. Right. I mean, I don't think my colleagues have.
Like he can't. So one of my big things, I love Stephen King and I love reading him. But like as I was reading him later, like you come to realize that he can't write a fully realized, understood person of color. They're always magical. They're always saving the white people, and so it would be interesting to see someone do something very similar to his works, like The Stand, for example, with Mother Abigail and everything like that. So it's interesting they mentioned Stephen King because I'm starting to see some of those elements too, particularly with the like ripping off the skin and everything. And
you know
it would
what?
be
I
kind of
bet
cool
you
if they brought in some of that as well and did the same twist that they're doing for Lovecraft.
I bet you someone's writing that book right now, because a lot of King is very Lovecraftian, right? And
racist in a completely different way.
Exactly.
Right? Like it's
yes. Okay, I says, I hope she appears again in a flashback and or as a ghost, but won't hold my breath. Is there a more marginalized and fetishized group than the native people of the Americas? Okay. A trend I really enjoyed in this episode was things and people not being what they appear to be. First, when Letty telling Tick he was her first, as she has been playing a 50s bombshell. Then there's the obvious link between Christina Braithwaite and William, who appears just after she goes in the house and then lays some sweet payback on the Captain Stakeout boys.
Okay, so that person was ahead of me and picked up on that way sooner than I did.
Say that again. Flesh that
They
out.
picked up on the whole like Christina William thing, and I still feel a little stupid that I was completely blindsided by that.
All right. And it says, this will be interesting when they make their link more or less clear, which of course they completely clarified in this one. Either that or I'm way off. No, you were right on target.
Well, I mean,
go ahead.
I don't know that Letty is being deceptive and displaying herself as a 50s bombshell. She's a virgin. She's supposed to walk around in white. I don't I don't understand that. I don't think she was misrepresenting herself at all. So
Right.
You can't swing your hips and be a virgin at the same
actual
time.
feminine woman.
There you go.
I mean,
It will be interesting to see William, who could get in the house where Christina couldn't, and where he and Ruby will end up in the morning. Okay, we've talked about that, right? The use of the elevator is a link to the floors of the house and the Freeman Braithwaite legacy. I'm looking forward to what comes next. Also, the family names or choices are great. The Braithwaites have an otherworldly coloring. We've talked about that before, right? It's as if they're related to Tolkien's elves. Imagine if Elven-esque was a word. I'm looking forward to the rest of the season. Will from Seatown out. Thank you very much, Will.
thanks, Will.
All righty. Just a couple more here. Rory James says, good point about not allowing Black children to be children. The Ouija board scene was tense. And then MLN says, love your dissection of the show. Yano episode 4 was released early. You can watch it now on HBO Max, by the way. All right. So I did catch up on that. So that's the viewer feedback for this week. Thank you so much for writing in. We
Thank
love
you.
to read what you send us and discuss it as a group. Okay, any final comments?
Make sure
All
you're
right.
registered to vote. Make sure you're registered to vote. Everybody
And vote.
vote. Vote, vote, vote.
Register and then vote. Actually do it.
So that about wraps it up for tonight's episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. Brothers and sisters, please tell the audience where they can find you on social media, and we'll start with Leandra.
Leandra Parris at Parris, Leandra Parris with 2 R's, Leandra. Same thing for Facebook and Instagram.
Vanessa.
Facebook, Dr. Vanessa Hintz. Twitter, at Dr. Vanessa Hintz. And Instagram, at Dr. Vanessa _Hintz. I'm basic.
There you go. Stanford.
Dr. Stanford Carpenter at SW Carpenter. That's SW Carpenter. And that's for Facebook and for Twitter.
Cianna.
Cianna Greaves. You can find me on Twitter at CC Greaves. That's at CICIGREAV as in Victor, ES as in Sam.
Byron.
Dr. Byron Craig, and you can find me on Twitter at Byron B. Craig, and on Instagram at Byron Steve, and on Facebook.
There you go. I'm Scott Jordan. You can find me on Twitter at dark_loops. You can find all episodes of the Seers of Ardham at the Dark Loops production channel on YouTube. If you'd like to leave feedback about the podcast, please leave it below on this YouTube channel or send a message to darkloopsproductions@gmail.com. We'll be sure to read it at the end of our next episode. So there it is. From all of us to all of you, big hugs. And remember,
Live
uninterrupted.
Bye. Bye-bye.
All right.
You don't need no reason to travel. Unknown horrors leaving in plain sight. Oh, God, stealing blame drives the world insane. Turn that evil darkness to healing.